Custom transitions. If you guys want to take down the code from GitHub, we will be doing some code exercises today and walking through actually implementing some of this custom transition stuff and doing a few examples. So that's on github.com/gdavis/Swift custom transitions. And we'll go ahead and get started. So first off, give you a little introduction about myself. My name is Grant Davis. I've been doing this thing for over 11 years now, iOS since it came out in 2008. And now I work as a freelance developer, so I get to get involved in a lot of different shops and see how a lot of people build their apps and get to work with a lot of different teams. So I feel like my exposure in this area has been pretty good. I've also got a decent list of clients on my portfolio. So just to give you a little bit of background, I actually started as a designer, got into animation and did a lot of Flash development. So I still really take animation very seriously. It's something that I have a lot of fun with, and it's pretty much why I put this talk together. So a quick overview quickly about what custom transitions are and what we're going to talk about. Well, this is transitioning between two UI view controllers. I think most of you already know that by being here. So we're going to take a look at the API and try and understand what all the parts are, because if you've looked at the API so far, it can be a little bit daunting with all the protocols and objects that are going on and what your responsibility is as a developer in order to get everything talking. We're going to set up a basic transition structure and just looking at how things are architected. We're going to look at a few different examples, actually 4 different examples today, showing how different custom transitions can facilitate different use cases. This is basically just a talk to give you a foundation on how custom transitions work. What we're not going to really do is, I'm not going to say this is the de facto way that you should set up your transitions and this is how you should organize things, because once you get past the basics, you'll understand that there's a lot of reasons that there's libraries out there that help sort of simplify how custom transitions are operated, and so basically what we're just going to be talking about is the protocols, getting it implemented like basically out of the box from the way Apple has put the API together. So why do we want to use custom transitions? Well, it really provides us a way to make a seamless transition when we're moving around the app. This helps us communicate the flow, where we're going, what we've been doing, and what our actions are. It makes your app stand out. It adds a level of polish, and it also can really communicate what the brand is for your app. Once you have an app that really leverages a lot of custom transitions, you sort of make a whole experience that becomes really custom tailored, and people really sort of, engage with that in a higher level than they would with just out-of-the-box transitions. It really makes things stand out. The most important thing, I think, for animation is it really provides context, and it really helps you understand what you're doing in the app, and really, it's a communication tool. The well-done transitions are always engaging, informative, and also fun. You should make a transition that's like cool to play with, and that's something I really love doing, because I really like, at the end of the project, you just sit down and watching somebody use it for the first time, they go, wow, that was cool, and are just kind of blown away with seeing something new and fresh that they haven't seen on every app that's just right out of the box. So like I said before, animations communicate with the user, and I'm going to be reiterating this a few times. Like, if you don't have a good way to communicate what's happening on screen, you should look at using custom transitions to sort of help that, facilitate that, and make that more apparent on what's going on. So when you should use this is when you're telling a story. If you don't have a story, you're not trying to communicate like, we hit an action here and then we're going into a detailed view here and we're actually going deeper, you're really probably doing something gratuitous, and it's really probably an unnecessary animation. Reasons to use it are to convey depth, structure, and anything, action that you've taken. So if you've deleted an item, maybe you have a cool way of taking whatever item you've been deleted and move it to a trash can or something to communicate that that's no longer something that's on your screen. And it also helps say, okay, this is where it went and why. If it's not clear what just happened in your app, that's probably a really good case for using a custom transition. If you are suddenly presented a new screen and you're not sure how you got there or what the correlation from where you just were was, then that's a really good place to say, okay, we maybe need an animation to help communicate the story a little bit better, to tell the user what's going on. Sometimes UI kit transitions are basic enough that it's not really clear what's going on. And this becomes a good spot for you to sort of, tell more. And like I said, with sort of how it can relate to a brand, it also provides a custom experience. So if you really tailor a really nice feeling app, people really match that and it becomes sort of a theme, and it's not only part of, you don't have a nicely designed app, but you also have a nicely animated app. And motion can really be a powerful sort of enhancer for what's going on and how people perceive your app. So let's now start talking about the API. And if you've looked at it, you've noticed that it's pretty much protocols all the way down. We have only a couple classes that are fully blown classes with APIs that we'll be calling and interacting with. Most of what is left up to us as developers is to use protocols, implement them in an order and fashion that they expect it to in order to communicate with the operating system. Because basically what's going to happen is we're going to get the system saying, okay, if you want to use custom transition, tell us what you're going to use. And then perform your animation, and then come back and tell the system when you're done. So you have to sort of manage, once the system hands over animation control to you, you have to know when to come back and then report back. So you'll determine the class structure and how to vend your animations. And then this is sort of what I was mentioning before, is there's a lot of different opportunity to structure your animations in different ways. And we'll have a couple of examples of like where we put our code, what class is responsible for what in terms of ordering, when an animation happens, and how you break those objects up. You also need to determine when an animation goes forward or backwards. So if you have a single animation controller, you might be saying, okay, I'm going to present this one, and then I'm going to dismiss this one. And then it's up to you to say, okay, I need to tell that animation controller which direction it's going, so you know how to perform that animation. And we'll have examples of this in our code, so it's more clear. We will be interacting with a transition context, and this is a system-provided class, and this is basically the object we'll be interacting with to tell the system how far we're through our transition, when our transition is complete, if it was canceled, things like that. With our interactive transitions, we'll be responsible for reporting the progress to the system. And that's what we'll do whenever we have a touch moving across the screen. We'll determine our percentage on how far through an animation or transition we are and appropriately notify the system. Like I said before, we'll also tell the context when everything is done, and that'll sort of say, okay, transition is complete, and now we're in our UI view controller as you would expect to. The nice thing about this is when we're building our animation controller classes, we have kind of free reign to use whatever animation tools that we want to. We're going to be pretty much using core animation in a couple of different ways, both through the UI kit methods, which are like UI view animate with duration, but we're also going to be using some core animation layers that are core animation based that are applied directly to layers. So that's like CA basic animation, CA animation, CA keyframe animation, those kind of things. So let's start looking at how these protocols are all structured and try and understand who talks to who and what responsibilities are for each protocol. So our parts break down like this. We've got our presented view controller that's going to be shown on the screen. When we, in our example, we're going to have a table view, and in our table view did select method, we're going to say, okay, this is the new view controller that we're going to go to, and we have to do this configuration on this presented view controller to determine and tell the system that we're going to be using a custom transition. So that comes with setting these two properties. Setting the transitioning delegate, which will say, tell the system that says this is the object that's responsible for actually telling you what animations we're going to be using. And then we also set the modal presentation style to be just custom. Once you have those two together, the system will then ask this animation vendor. Well, animation vendor is a name I use for this. This is not actual API names. I just felt like I should call it that instead of referring to UI view controller transitioning delegate every time. So basically the responsibility of that delegate protocol is to vend animations, to provide the system saying, okay, the system will say, here's the view controller we're going to. Now tell us what animation transition we should use to get to that view. And that's where your animation vendor comes in. The transitioning context is that system provided object. This is going to be passed as a parameter into your methods to your delegates that implement the animation protocols. So basically, the transition context is going to tell us things like the view controller that we're going to, the view controller we're coming from, the container view that both of them should be working with or be put in order to perform the animation. So So it gives us a lot of things that we'll be needing to do our animations, and it's really important because we'll be interacting with it pretty much for every controller, or we will be acting on it with every animation controller. So the animation controller implements UI view controller animated transitioning, and this is what actually does the meat of the animation. This is where you're actually going to be writing your animation code to say, take this layer, put it over here, resize it to this, and then through our callback functions, we'll know when to tell the transitioning context when everything is all wrapped up. And then once we get into interactive transitions, we have another protocol called UI view controller interactive transitioning. And basically, this is just a couple of new methods that says, okay, now you need to start an interactive transition. You need to stop an interactive transition to cancel it. It provides a framework of methods that the system will be calling for whenever you want to do something interactive. Okay, so this is the cycle of how things talk to each other once you're trying to perform an animation. First, we're going to have the presenting view controller, which actually is going to be displaying the presented view controller. This is typically, UI view controller subclass, a navigation controller, or a UI tab bar controller. Through the method calls of present view controller animated or push view controller animated, we'll then be presenting this. View controller, the presented view controller, which is configured with the transitioning delegate object. So that's our animation vendor, and this, in a couple of our examples, is going to be the presenting view controller is going to be the transitioning delegate. But we're also going to do an example where we have the presented view controller is its own transitioning delegate because it sort of is responsible for knowing how it should display because it's going to be a modal pop-up. So context is pretty important here on when you choose what the object is going to be for your transitioning delegate. You want to choose what makes sense for presenting that view. Is this view going to always be presented in the same way? If it is, then maybe you should put the transitioning code within that same class. If it's going to be something that doesn't really matter which view you're going to, or you just want to choose a different transition between a different full screen view, then you can have the presented view controller be the delegate. So once you have that delegate set, the system is going to call animation controller for presented controller. It's going to pass you the presenting controller and the source controller. And from this method, that's when you return animation controller objects. These are the classes that implement animated transitioning and interactive transitioning protocols. So these are the ones that actually perform the animation and do all the bulk of creating either core animation layers or running through UIKit layers, or animations, I should say. So that transitioning context is then going to call a couple methods to get things started. It's first going to ask the transition duration on the animation controller, say how long are you going to take for this? And it's going to pass it a reference to the context so you can get an idea of, okay, what are the controllers involved and where are they going to? And then after that, we get the animate transition method called, which is kind of hanging off the bottom there. But animate transition, that's where you say, okay, this is where we actually put all our animations and kick everything off. So then the animation controller is going to do its animation, and once it's done, it comes back and tells the transition context, hey, I'm finished. You can now hand the control back over to the system and finish presenting that controller. So that's pretty much our cycle right there. And that brings us into the first transition that we're going to make here. This is just going to be a basic zoom transition, which is going to kind of replicate what the springboard does when you open an app. It's going to zoom in to a new view. It's going to be presented modally over the top of our content. Our animation is going to be based on UIKit because we're going to keep it pretty simple. All we're going to do is be changing the alpha and scale to bring these two in. So we'll just be adding an animation to the one we're coming from and then the one we're going to, and it's just going to be those two properties. Like I said, it's a similar effect to the springboard. And here's just a quick visual of what we're going after. Okay? So for our basic transitioning steps, we're just going to walk through what we're going to do here. We're just going to configure the presenting view controller. We're going to determine which animation controller we want to use. Get information from the context when we actually perform our animation to know which views we should be manipulating in our animation. We're going to actually then perform it, and then tell the context when we're done. So now we'll hop over to Xcode here. And if you're following along, you can open up the workflow walkthrough folder, and then just open up number 1 Zoom here, and that'll give you the project we're looking at here. So to walk through this real quick, we have a single storyboard for all of our view controllers, and you see that we have our table view that has the different rows that we're going to click on for our different animations. We're going to be just going into this detail view controller, which has a storyboard identifier that we're going to be referencing to display it. If we go ahead and run this right now, I can show you that there's no smoke and mirrors. It's basically just a very simple present view controller modal display, right? So it slides up from bottom, standard UI kit, animation. And then pretty much all these do the same thing, right? So that's where we're starting from. So looking at our class schedule here, we're going to be looking at this the transitions table view object. And so this is where we're going to start presenting our views. And we have our method here, did select row index path, and we already have some boilerplate coding here just to say, okay, this is the view that we're going to just instantiate using an enumeration of identifiers to pull out what we're actually going to be displaying. So the first thing we'll need to do is configure this detail VC with our transitioning delegate, which is going to be this class, which means that we'll also need to implement the protocol up here for the transitioning delegate. We'll then need to tell the detail VC that its presentation or modal presentation style is custom. Okay, and that's all we need to do to tell the system that we want to make a custom transition. From that point, we now implement those transition delegate methods, and this will be this set of code. So what we're doing here is we're making a lazy variable for a Zoom animation controller. We haven't created this yet, but this is we're about to make the Zoom animation controller class. And what we're going to do in this method here is when it's passing in which view we're actually going to present, we're going to check its class type to make sure that whenever we handle this detail view controller, we're going to give it a Zoom animation. There's another line here where we're telling it, okay, which direction our animation controller is going to be going. And since we are in the presented view controller method instead of the dismissed view controller method, we know that we're going forward, so reverse animation is false. Same thing down for the dismissed view controller. We check the class, return the animation. So now we can go in here and actually create this object. So we've got our Zoom animation controller. Okay, so in here we're going to implement a delegate method that says that we're responsible for the animation, or the protocol, I should say. So we're going to have UI view controller, animated transitioning is the protocol we implement. We will then throw in the implementation of what that's going to look like. And so I'm doing a couple things here where I'm using a struct to determine what our minimum size is going to be and what our maximum size is going to be, and also a public variable to determine which direction we're going with this reverse animation. The first thing we implement is our transition duration, and we're just going to do a quick half second. And then here in our animate transition, here's where we're going to determine, okay, which direction are we going to go? And I'm going to break up our animation into 2 different methods, animate in and animate out, so it's clear what's going on in each of those. And there's definitely room for improvement here where you could say, let's have one animate method and just use a Boolean internally and clean it up. But for the sake of simplicity, we're just going to divide it up here into 2 clear, concise methods. So we'll throw those in. And we'll take a look at what our animation's doing now. So for our animate in, we're going to be passing this transition context. And so what's important here is we're pulling out references to the objects involved in this transition by calling this view controller for key and then passing in a UI transition context from view controller key. This gets us the from view controller that we're coming from. And then we have the to view controller. And so these will be reversed whether we're going in or out, right? So if we're going reversed, then we know we're going back to the detail view and or going back to the table view and coming from the detail view. So in this case, we're actually going from the table view to the detail view, and that's, you can see that from the from value and the to value here. The other really important thing about making a transition is you're provided the container view. So in this line, we actually ask the context, hey, tell me what view we're putting everything in. And so as we add in the detail view, we're going to be adding it to that container, and that's where we're going to be performing our animations. The duration we're going to pull right off of this class, so we know how quickly our animation is going to be. And so the first thing that we need to do is just take the container view and give it the subview of the new detail view. We go ahead and size the detail view to the container view's bounds, so we fill the whole container because we know it's just going to be a full-sized view. And we'll be doing that a little bit differently later on when we do a pop-up where it's not a full screen thing. So you have full control over how big you want your frame to be. So to get this thing started, we're just going to set the details alpha to 0. We're going to get a transform of the maximum value. So our detail view, when it comes in, is going to be scaled high, and then it's going to come and shrink down and land on the screen. So to do that, all we then do is do an animate with duration. We tell the detail view it's going to be 100% when it's done, and we give it a identity transform to say basically just go back to your standard size. And then the table view actually gets sized down to our minimum zoom scale. So from there, that's pretty much the animation guts. And then when we have our completed block fire, we're going to return the table view to its original state. If we don't do this, the table view will stay at that shrunk size. So when you try and animate out of this view, it'll still be the 25% or whatever our value is. So you need to make sure that when you finish animation, you kind of need to reset things back to the state they're supposed to be in. So the animate out is very much similar. All we're doing is reversing, which object is getting scaled, which one is getting faded out, and which order it happens in. And in the end, we always have to say transition context, complete transition. The Boolean that we pass in here tells the system whether or not it was actually finished or not. So this will tell, if it doesn't finish, then it won't be displaying the detail view that we're going into. But if it does finish, then it knows that, okay, everything's successful. I can go ahead and present this detail view. And this becomes pretty important when we do interactive transitions, and it's really easy to pull your finger only a little bit of the way across the screen, but you actually want to cancel that animation and go back to the view you're on. So we can now compile this and check it out. And then there's our transition. Pretty straightforward, pretty easy to do. So that's like our easiest transition that we're going to do today. Now we'll switch back over to Keynote. And now we're going to be taking a look at doing something a little more fancy with a pop-up animation. So this is going to be a modally displayed view. It's going to sit on top of our content, and we're kind of basically replicating a UI alert view, but we're going to do it in our own fancy fashion. This is going to be core animation based, so the code here might look a little bit lengthy, but it's still pretty simple on what we're doing. But if you've worked with core animation, you know it can be a little verbose to get what you want done. We're also going to be using a custom overlay view. So this is basically just a dimmer that's going to sit over the content in the background and just darken things up. What the takeaway of that is that we can basically make a view in our animation controllers only that will still be on screen even when the animation is done. So since you have full control over the container view, the animation can really dictate what's on screen, where things are, and you can add extra frills or whatever that you want to in your animation that will still be part of the presented view. So in order to do this pop-up, we're going to be changing alpha, we're going to be doing a transform effect, and we're going to be using keyframe-based animation to sort of move through all of our different states. So as a quick visual of what we're going to be doing, we're going to have this gummy-looking pop-up come into screen. It's going to have nice, like, shrinking, bouncing, stretchy sort of effect, and then disappear when it goes out. So a couple of tips on working with core animation. You'll need to keep a reference to the transitioning context because the way core animation works is usually you have a delegate method that's going to be saying, okay, this is when animation is complete or not. So usually in that case, you need to have a reference to the transitioning context. What we're going to be doing to simplify that a little bit and sort of make core animation a little bit more of like a modern approach is we're going to actually have a helper category that's going to change our animations to use a completion block. So all we have to do is set a completion like we normally would on a UI view, animate with the duration method, and it'll keep things a little bit cleaner for us. So with core animation, you also want to make sure that you set the final value of whatever property you're animating. If you don't do that, you'll actually have a bit of a hiccup towards the end of your animation. Things will basically snap back to the starting point. So you'll say, okay, I want to do this animation, I'll add it to the layer, and you make that, set your two values and your from values for your animation. But if you don't actually set the real value of what the final animation is going to land at, you'll get snapped back to the beginning like it never actually happened, which will make your animation look jittery and broken. So that's something I spent some time on figuring out, so it's worth mentioning. We're going to get more into this later, but core animation works really well with UI %-driven interactive animation, and I'll explain more later, but if you are using interactive transitions, you should be using core animation. So let's take a look at the demo. So we'll still go back here to our table view controller, and we're going to configure our presented view controller the way we did previously. So we're going to have a pop-up VC, transitioning delegate. Actually, I'm sorry, I'm going to take that back. We're going to make this one a little bit differently. Because this is a pop-up, we're going to assume that the pop-up is what's going to control how it's displayed. Because it's always going to display in the same fashion. It's always going to be like an alert view centered in the screen with a dimmer view over the back of it. So in terms of context, the table view doesn't really care where it's presenting it. It just wants to show basically an alert view in the same spot all the time. So instead of making this class responsible for determining what the animation controller is, we're going to embed that in the pop-up view controllers class. So what we're going to do is actually just make this within this class here. And so our pop-up view controller, all it's doing right now is setting this preferred content size. And so we're going to use that value to determine, okay, this is what the size of our view is going to be when it's displayed modally. It's not going to be full screen, and this makes it so that we can kind of customize this and change our pop-up around to be a different size whenever. The other stuff going on here is just styling a little bit to give it some borders and colors, and then we're going to have a tap gesture that's just going to dismiss it when we're done. So to get started, we're going to implement UI view controller transitioning delegate, which is already defined here. And then we're going to add in our pop-up methods. So what we have here in our init method is setting the transitioning delegate to ourself, and then setting the modal presentation style to custom. So we're doing this internally so that we can handle all this internally. What we're then going to also do is still create a pop-up animation controller, and this class is just going to say, just like we did previously, what direction we're going in, and then return that animation whenever the system asks for it. So now when we go ahead and create that transition, make a new file here called pop-up animation controller, if I can type. Okay, then we'll implement our UI view, come on, autocomplete, animated transitioning delegate. Okay, and so similar to other class, we have our reverse animation Boolean. We're going to have a lazily instructed UI view that's going to act as our dimmer, and all we're doing is configuring that with a 80% black color. We're going to have our transitioning duration be a little bit longer at a second and 0.25. Again, we're going to do the same sort of technique we did before by saying, okay, if we're animating in, we'll be calling a different method than when we animate out. And to show those methods here, here's what we're going to be doing. So start this thing off. We pull off our values from the transitioning context. We get our duration, we get the container view, the pop-up view, and then we ask the pop-up view that we're displaying for its size that was defined as the preferred content size. So from here, we're going to be doing a few scaling values where we actually just make different translations and transforms to scale things, move things off screen, and then bring them in. And this, like I said, can be a little bit verbose, but if you're familiar with core animation, this is kind of what you have to go through to get the job done. And here, I'm going to have a completion block. So we're basically going to have our dimmer fade animation come in, And then we're going to have our transform animation come in, and then when that's done, that's when we know that our transition is complete. Since I'm using this completion block, it's a little bit simpler, so we don't have to actually keep a property reference around to our transition context. We can just sort of keep it in the block, and then everything will work just fine. So if you want to keep looking through here, I mean, we're just looking through setting, adding the animation. So once the dimmer fade is animated, we're then going to add in our transform animation. So the first thing we do is dim the screen, and then we're going to transform the pop-up as it comes in, shrink it into size and place and alpha, and then once that's done, we say it's finished. Okay, so the animate out method is basically very similar. It's just reversing everything around. So instead of popping it in from the top and shrinking it in off screen vertically, we're going to scale it up and then down and out of the screen. So again, this is just basic animation stuff. The important things is we need to tell the context when we're done. So to give an example of this thing running, there's our custom pop-up animation. So you can see even when the transition finishes, our dimmer view is not removed from the background. The state of your animation is basically kept intact, right? So you can kind of, like I said, put any sort of design or background around to help facilitate the animation. If you wanted to put a, dancing graphic in the background or something that's related to this animation, you totally have the option to do that. So what's nice about that is it's actually, this, basically, once this is presented, we get all of our normal view will appear, view did appear, view will disappear type actions when we click and tap. So that's that demo. Okay, now we're going to get into the little more complicated, a little more cool and fun transitions. So going through the steps on how to perform this, we're going to see that this is very similar to what we've previously been done. We're just going to add a couple extra steps to make things interactive. So we're going to configure our presented view controller like we did before, give it the transitioning delegate, give it the presentation style. We determine which animation controller to use, so we're going to create a new animation controller that's going to be based on interactive elements. We are also going to be asked to give it the interactive controller to use. So the system basically will ask us for the normal animation and an interactive transition or an interactive controller, and we need to determine how we separate this out in our code. What we're going to do is actually have a single animation controller that is basically adopting both protocols. So we don't have to separate out two different classes to handle the interactive side and the animation side. We're going to still get information from the context to know what we're working with. The difference in the animation is we're going to create the animation, but we don't actually start it and make it go all the way through. We basically say, okay, this is the animation we're going to use, and then the system takes control to actually increment how far through that animation we are. And we do that by updating the transitioning context, telling it what the progress is of the animation. And we'll be using our gesture recognizer to figure out and calculate how far their thumb is across the screen to determine what our progress is. And then when we're done, we tell the transitioning context when we're canceled or complete. The important line here is we actually have to worry about whether or not we're canceled. And I mentioned this before, but we're going to actually have some states where if they're less than halfway across the screen with their thumb, then we're going to consider that being a canceled animation when they lift off. When it's complete, we're going to actually finish the transition and animate to 100% when they lift off. So just highlighting what's different here from what we've done previously is just these few lines. So there's really not too much more to do on interactive controller other than being aware of setting the progress, handling a canceled state, and then on this next screen, there's a couple other considerations. And we've also, and I also talked on this already, we need to keep a reference to the transitioning context. We need to keep talking to the system to tell it what's going on with our animation. We need to determine when things are completed or canceled. Handling the cancel animation is not performed automatically for you. So what we're going to be doing is saying, as our finger moves around, we're going to be constantly telling the system, okay, this is the current progress. But if you lift up your finger and you have a canceled animation, the system will not animate back to that previous state for you. You actually have to do the animation and adjust the progress to get back to 0 or 100%, whichever way you're going. And you will have some some code that shows how to handle that. We're also going to be using this UI percent-driven interactive transition object. We're actually going to be subclassing this. What this class does is provides a really simple way of moving through a core animated transition. And by using this, we basically avoid having to do all the legwork of updating our animation as we go through it. As long as we just say, hey, you're 50% of the way through, the system will move your animation to that 50% point, and you don't have to worry about it. All you're going to say is, let's update the transition to this point. Yeah, so this is all just reiterating what I just said. So looking at the chart on how things now work in terms of who communicates with who, we're going to have our animation vendor. It's going to have the same animation controller for presented view controller. We return whichever animation controller we want to use for that. And then it's going to be, the system's going to call another method, interaction controller for presentation. We're going to return the same object here, just implements the UI view controller interactive transitioning protocol as well. Once the animation gets started, the transitioning context is going to say, give me your transition duration, give me the animate, and then tell us to animate the transition, passing the context as a parameter. And then it'll also, on the interactive controller, call this start interactive transition. So what we're going to be doing here is basically capturing where the finger is at that point to give us like a start value on where our transition currently is. From there, it's up to us to then report back to the system. The system sort of said, okay, your animation is go now, do whatever you need to do, and it's up to us to say, okay, this is when we're going to update, how we're going to update it, and then we determine whether or not we need to cancel the interactive transition, finish the interactive transition, and then also complete the transition. So all the steps that we still had to do for a normal animation controller still are relevant here in interactive controller. We just also have to be responsible for updating the interactive transition, canceling it, and finishing it. And you also have to always call finish interactive transition and then complete transition. It's sort of an order of operations that the system expects. So that is important to get that in the right order. So as you just saw there with that transition, we're going to be doing an interactive cube 3D transition. We're going to be using a navigation controller to do this so we can make use of the gesture that it already has built into the navigation controller. So this is the interactive pop, so when you move your finger on the left side of the screen and slide over, that's the gesture that we're going to be leveraging to start this. It's core animation based. The subclass is the UI percent driven interactive transition object. And here's a quick demo of what it's going to look like. Okay? So when working with a navigation controller, we just have to implement the navigation controller delegate. It has a couple methods for returning animation controllers, which look like this. So very much the same. What's important here is when you get this first method, navigation controller, animation controller for operation, that operation is either going to be a push or a pop. And so you can do a switch case off of that to determine which direction you're actually heading in your animation. You can also do this with the UI tab bar controller. We're not going to cover that today. So let's hop over to Xcode. Okay, so back in our table view, we're going to configure this cube detail VC, the transitioning delegate, and a modal presentation style. We're then going to make a new lazy property here for our cube animation. Which we haven't created yet, but we will. And then in here we'll do a very similar sort of if statement check where we say if this is the, I think it's the cube view controller, is that right? So cube detail view controller. And then we'll just return our cube animation configured with the direction that we need. And essentially do the same thing over in this dismiss method. Just like that. Now we can go ahead and create the new object that's actually going to perform the animation. This is going to have our two different methods, one for the normal animated transitioning and the interactive transitioning. That was the wrong one. UI controller, interactive transitioning, that one. Okay, so now this is going to be our cube animation. So we have a few constants in the top here that are just going to help facilitate this 3D rotation. I won't get too deep in how this actually is performed, but we'll quickly walk through and say, okay, we're going to keep a reference in this class to the transition context. This is important because we don't have a completion block we can just reference this in. We actually need to keep a reference around to this so we can say, okay, let's update it when our finger moves around. This right now is just going to do a basic animation to basically it'll perform a non-interactive transition and also an interactive transition at this point, depending on how it's configured. So you could still say, I wanted to present this cube transition, and it'll just rotate the screen without any interaction and then back out without doing the interactive stuff. So what we have going through all this is, we pull out the view controllers that we're going to work with. We set up a 3D scene, and then we determine in this method here, what type of animation we're actually going to apply. And this is just a matter of determining how we're going to transform the object and providing different 3D transform objects. So in this method here, when we actually have our destination view controller completion block, we're going to tell the transition when we're complete. And we actually have a condition here. If it's successful and the transition wasn't canceled, then it was complete. So we're going to have a case here where we need to kind of determine, if it was canceled, it's going to obviously not be a successful transition. So one last thing, we need to go back to our table view over here, and we need to implement UI navigation controller delegate. Okay. And we actually need to provide, actually, yeah, okay. What I did up here, actually, sorry, I messed this up. That, we don't want this being returned in these methods here. All we really need is a navigation controller method. Since we're using a navigation to push this thing in, I put it in the wrong spot, sorry about that. So, let's see. Sorry, I'm catching up on my notes here. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're actually going to reference and use an interactive pop gesture from the navigation controller in this method here. So since this gesture is already being used for the navigation controller, we're just going to leverage that as being what our input is from the user. And then okay, so we have this other method here, navigation controller, which asks for the interaction controller for animation controller. And this is going to say, okay, if our cube animation is currently interactive, we're going to return our cube animation. We determine whether or not it's interactive by how it started, basically. And let's see, let's go to my cube animation. So this cube animation is also going to be a UI %-driven interactive transition subclass. So we add that instead of NS object. We're going to need to implement a UI gesture recognizer delegate in order to handle all the touches that we're going to be receiving. Right here, we're going to add in some variables for actually handling the interactive properties. So whether or not it's interactive and where the finger currently starts when we move. And we also have this animation timer object, which is basically going to advance the animation when we need to go and cancel the animation or complete an animation. So now we're looking at this. Let's see. 76. So here, we're going to put in our code for actually handling the interaction. So this is kind of where a lot of the bulk of this interactive transition happens. We are going to have our gesture recognizer method or property here. It's going to be our interactive gesture that we set in our previous class. We're going to set ourselves as the delegate, give ourselves a target for when we actually do a screen pan operation. And then here, we have a method, gesture recognizer should begin. We determine whether or not, when we want to use this animation, and also determine when we actually have an interactive controller. So if our gesture is beginning, we know that we're doing interactive transition. If this method never fires, then we're being queued up as a normal transition. That's just going to go from point A to point B. So when our pan gesture fires, we're going to have a screen edge did pan. And here's where we do our calculations to say, okay, here's where the touch point is. Here's where it is in relation to the whole screen. It gives us a progress value. If we're currently changing this recognizer, then we update it with our progress. If our progress gets to a certain high value where it's almost 100%, we're just going to say, okay, let's finish. We're pretty much there. Our finger is at the edge of the screen. When the touches end or are canceled, we then have to do this part where we say, okay, now we need to animate our transition to the start point or the end point of to finish this thing off. And this is where I was mentioning before, we're going to just check to see, okay, if our finger is over halfway across the screen, then we're going to complete it. If it's not, then we go to 0% complete. And then we just have some code here say, okay, when we animate to that percent, it's going to create a timer, it's going to adjust that percentage, and then do the final sort of animation. So this is a lot of code. I definitely won't deny that. But this is kind of what you need to go through for an interactive transition. And okay, so it looks like things will compile. Oh, but I missed a step somewhere. Debugging on the fly here, one sec. Delegate. I think we need, oh, I'm sorry, yeah, so self.navigation controller. We need to set the delegate of the navigation controller to this class. And I'm pretty sure that's what we're missing. There we go. So as I just tap on the cell, this is just doing the basic animation. As I start to drag on the screen, we now have our interactive transitioning happening. So as I move my finger over halfway and let go, it'll complete. If I were to only drag it a little bit of the way and let go, it wouldn't finish. It would go back and cancel. So it looks like I'm about running out of time. I had one more demo, but things went a little longer than I expected. So I'm going to hop back here and wrap up. So using transitions should be best used to communicate to the users. Avoid using things that don't have a purpose. Animations should definitely not distract. It should almost kind of be like, sometimes you don't even notice they're there. They just feel so natural. They should always enhance the experience. And when you're doing this stuff, experimenting is where the fun is at. You want to make something that seems really cool, it feels really fun, and enjoy it. So that's it for me. Any questions while I'm still here?